It didn't take long for the Mexicans to start showing signs of weakness. Ordaz managed to slash his way through the ranks and eventually, amidst significant bloodshed, made it back to the Spanish base. 1 Spaniard and 8 Tlaxcalans lost their lives, while Ordaz and the majority of his squadron were injured. Following this catastrophic event, Cortes anticipated the Mexicans would back down from any further conflicts. However, he was wrong. Barely had the Spanish team returned to their base when they noticed the opposing team preparing in large groups for an all-out attack. Cortes immediately set up the required defense mechanisms, kicking off a battle that, for its bravery and persistence, has barely seen a rival. The Mexicans launched their assault with such clamor from drums and horns, coupled with terrifying war cries, that the thunderous sound of the cannon almost went unnoticed. They seemed collectively resolute to either achieve victory or die trying. Some maintained a constant rain of arrows and rocks. Others, disregarding life, aimed to climb the walls and gain control of the gates. Some men even clambered onto others' shoulders to attain the wall's peak, and when they were shoved off, dead or hurt, others quickly filled in. Their grit was such that they stepped on the fallen and injured to close the gaps, and, despite the ghastly cannon and firearm damage among them, they maintained their fierce confrontation until, after a brutal loss, superstitious beliefs compelled them to halt the battle and pull out, given their custom to never fight after sunset. And it was now evening. The ensuing night wasn't much calmer. Although the Mexicans didn't dare engage in combat, they figured out ways to ignite the Spanish structures, and only through significant efforts was a widespread fire forestalled. Even given the fatigue from the battle and the prior night's efforts to contain the fires, at first light, the Spanish team was back at their stations, ready to ward off another assault. Bloody skirmishes came one after another. The vengeance of this embittered group seemed unquenchable, and each new effort to breach the Spanish fortress failed. Cortes, using different strategies, slaughtered thousands of the natives and caused severe damage to a portion of their city with fires. Cortes met the same fate as many of his troops and ended up injured. He got hit by an arrow in the left hand. Following this, he retreated to his living quarters so he could, without distractions, devise a strategy to break free from his dangerous predicament. He had barely started to collect his thoughts when the chaos resumed on all fronts of the living quarters, as the Mexicans had now grouped for a comprehensive attack. He rushed back, realizing his assistance was more crucial than ever, as the opponent was now combating with even more bravery than the previous day, and all his alertness and proficiency were necessary to provide defense at every location. In the peak of the combat, the unfortunate Montezuma chose, some suggest willingly, others indicate at the Spaniard's request, to try and put an end to the violence by revealing himself to his furious followers and reminding them of their due obedience. He put on his key regalia, placed the ruling crown on his head, and flaunted the trove of gems that he typically wore on ceremonial occasions. Suited up in this manner, he proceeded to the Spanish stronghold, accompanied by some influential Mexicans. One of them climbed the wall and implored the incensed multitude that their ruler had arrived and was prepared to hear their objections and cease the conflict with the foreign guests. On hearing his name, the combat came to a halt, and a reverential quietude followed. The unfortunate ruler himself then clambered onto the wall. All bowed in homage, some dropped to their knees and kissed the ground. Scanning the crowd, Montezuma identified the chiefs and, after expressing gratitude for their loyalty, reassured them they were mistaken in thinking he was a captive. He had simply stayed among his guests for a long time in order to familiarize himself with their traditions and show his respect for the powerful leader they represented. As he was about to leave them, he pleaded with his citizens to put down their weapons and go back to their homes. When Montezuma finished speaking, there was a total silence for a few moments. But then a faint buzz started and quickly escalated into a complete uproar. The bravest and most audacious in the crowd threw insults at their leader, yelling that he was no longer Mexico's emperor, but a despicable traitor and a pathetic slave to their homeland's enemy. Montezuma attempted to talk and signaled for quiet with his hand, but it was useless. There was a huge commotion, and in just a split second, arrows and rocks were flung at him. The 2 soldiers that Cortes had assigned to him tried using their shields for his protection, but it was too late. His measure of suffering was at its limit. He was hit with multiple arrows, and a head injury from a rock knocked him unconscious. Stunned by this tragic occurrence, Cortes carried the nearly unconscious king to his own residence, hoping to save him, then furiously dashed back to exact a brutal vengeance. But it was already too late. The moment they saw their emperor drop, the Mexicans scattered, as though bracing for a divine flame to rain down on them for this ruthless act. Meanwhile, Montezuma came back to his senses, but his state was heartbreaking. His subjects' behavior drove him nearly mad. They had to restrain his hands to stop him from self-harm. Cortes' attempts to soothe him were in vain. He rejected all attempts to comfort him, ripped off his wound dressings, and endeavored to end his own life. These violent episodes, and his stubborn refusal to eat fast-tracked his demise. He died cursing his subjects, and dashed the Spaniards' hopes by scornfully refusing the offer of the Christian faith in his last moments. When Father Olmedo knelt by his side, lifting the cross and fervent in his pleas for Montezuma to accept it, he coldly dismissed the priest, declaring, "I have only a few hours left, and I will not betray my ancestors' faith." His children's futures, particularly those of his 3 daughters, weighed heavily on him. He summoned Cortes to his bedside and entrusted these children to him as the most valuable legacy he would leave behind. He begged him to ensure they were not left stranded and received their deemed share of his estate. "Your king, the King of Spain, should do this," Montezuma asserted. "If not for the amicable service I've given the Spaniards and the care I've shown them, which led me to this miserable state. But even that hasn't disillusioned me of them." According to Cortes, these were the dying emperor's last words. Not long afterward, on June 30th, 1520, he died in the arms of one of his loyal noblemen. As long as Montezuma suffered from his injuries, his subjects remained calm. However, as soon as he passed, they geared up for the selection of a new king and an imminent recommencement of conflict. Montezuma's successor was his brother, Cuitlahuac, a courageous and warlike prince who passed suddenly from smallpox 4 months into his reign as emperor. The latest ruler launched an assault that heavily burdened the Spanish. He assigned his toughest men to command the flat rooftop and tower of the main temple, positioned close to the Spanish camp. From these strategic locations, they had the ability to thrust rocks and beams into the inner courtyard. Cortes, who was earnestly considering escape, was hindered in organizing the required setup and deemed it essential to eliminate the enemy from this threatening spot. He delegated this task to Escobar, one of his most fearless sergeants, whom he put in charge of an elite soldier group. Simultaneously, he resolved to oust the adversary from the local streets with his remaining troops, to ensure they were accessible for the ones attacking the temple. Escobar moved forward, facing no pushback till the base of the temple stairs, a count of 100. Despite this, midway up the climb, a large number of opponents emerged at the fences and dropped such a torrent of arrows, stones, and beams onto them that he and his troops could no longer resist their power. Thrice he strived to overcome the insurmountable, and thrice he was repelled. Hearing of their predicament, Cortes, who had been industrious in the meanwhile, promptly dismounted from his horse, fastened his shield onto his arm as his wounded hand hindered him from carrying it, and charged with an unsheathed sword to the temple stairs. He urged his soldiers to join him and advanced, seemingly, to face his inevitable demise. He knocked down every obstruction that stood in his path and finally reached the flat temple rooftop, where the cream of the Mexicans had assembled, resolute to either win or perish. An intense face-to-face clash broke out, involving clubs and swords, with every individual adamant to exchange their life as expensively as they could. No one was ready to surrender, even at the risk of being slaughtered. Some who could not endure the loss of their freedom chose to jump from the temple peak, and all demonstrated a lion-hearted valor that was unprecedented in the New World. As Cortes was engaged in this high-risk battle, his squad within the city was not faring well. Upon overtaking the temple, he quickly lent his aid to the remainder of his troops. He mounted his horse, slung the reins over his left arm, and with a lowered lance, barreled into the opposition, knocking down anyone in his path. However, his fervour led him so deep into the fray that when he attempted to turn his horse around, he found himself ensnared by a surging mass of adversaries, making it seemingly impossible to cut through. His predicament was dangerous, but he acted swiftly to find an escape. He spotted a side street not as crowded with enemies. He entered this path and promptly reunited with his forces. In doing so, he realized his friend, Andreas Duero, had been captured and was being hauled off to the temple by a large mob, intended to serve as the next sacrifice to their deities. Cortes didn't hesitate and, disregarding the size of the opposition, charged into them to save his companion. He dispersed those responsible for taking him, and Duero, upon his release, with his knife dealt with one enemy, attempting to restrain him, and another restraining his horse. He emerged unscathed, mounted the horse, and the pair successfully rejoined their comrades. Cortes regarded this feat as his proudest moment. The enemy began to retreat from all angles. Hence, to prevent further harm, and to allow his tired soldiers a chance to recuperate, Cortes signalled for retreat. They pulled back to their base and tended to their injuries. Chapter 13. Cortes, ready to withdraw, discovers the causeways destroyed. The Spaniards flee with substantial loss. The Tlaxcalans stay loyal. Guatemozin is elected Emperor of Mexico. The following day saw an uneasy peace, as both groups maintained a quiet standoff. Cortes was preparing to depart, and the Mexicans didn't seem inclined to restart the conflict. However, their calm demeanor was deceptive, masking their resolute determination to eliminate the Spaniards entirely. They were quietly pivoting to a new strategy. To ensure this, intending to thwart his retreat by destroying the causeways, effectively trapping them, and leaving them to die of starvation. But as always, Cortes's foresight was impeccable. He rapidly constructed a portable bridge that could be deployed exactly where the breach in the causeway was. Once prepared, he commanded that the withdrawal should occur during the cover of darkness. He was banking on either the obscurity of night to allow for an undetected escape, or the well-documented Mexican fear of nocturnal activities to deter them from intervening. However, he underestimated the resolve of his adversaries. As darkness fell, he split his forces into 3 groups. Sandoval was chosen to command the vanguard. He personally led the main body, while Velázquez de León, a close kin of the governor of Cuba, marshaled the rear. The troop exited silently in the depth of midnight. Making any noise was strictly prohibited, and the falling rain worked to their advantage. Initially, they didn't find any sign of prepared resistance, and they finally arrived at the causeway leading to Tacuba, a route chosen by Cortes for 2 reasons. Primarily because it was the quickest, and secondarily, he speculated that the Mexicans might not have severed it, as it diverged away from the direction the Spaniards originally used for their approach. However, their optimism was swiftly crushed. Upon arrival, they found it cut off. Using a pontoon bridge, they tried to traverse the gap, but before they completed it, the chilling war cry of the enemy rang out, signifying death and ruin all around. Canoes swarmed the lake in an instant. The battle kicked off with a fearsome barrage of arrows and stones. The location, the darkness, and the ferocity of the attackers made this battle significantly lethal in history. The Spanish forces found themselves trapped on a narrow dock between 2 gaps. They attempted to lift their bridge and relocate it to the second gap, but the heavy artillery had wedged it tightly between the rocks, making it immovable. All their efforts proved fruitless, as they were assailed unrelentingly from all directions, leaving them without a glimmer of hope for either victory or escape. The Mexicans fought fiercely, resolved to either perish themselves or annihilate their homeland's adversaries. The Spanish forces used every bit of their tactical prowess and strength to forge a path, but whenever they cleared a way with their blades, new combatants replaced the fallen, Their opponents surged at them so overwhelmingly they couldn't even employ their firearms. Finally, fatigue set in. They could no longer stand against the incessant wave of fighters. Their front lines faltered, inciting widespread chaos. Infantry and cavalry, allies and enemies alike, were so closely entwined that they battled haphazardly, unaware in the darkness of whether their blows landed on friend or foe. In the throes of this horrific carnage, Cortes managed to rally around 100 men and attempted to hack a path through the chaos. Eventually, he reached the mainland. However, he couldn't bear the thought of his personal escape while the majority of his troops remained in peril. Choosing those who were not injured, he resolved to return and face the fate of his comrades. Some had successfully battled their way to him, but his joy at their arrival quickly transformed to sorrow as he noticed the Mexicans hauling away living captives to be offered up to their gods. He tried to rescue them, but could do nothing more than safeguard the small group who escaped, all so fatigued that they couldn't re-enter the battle. The majority of his army had either been killed in combat or drowned. As dawn arrived, it unveiled a horrific scene. Over half of the Spaniards and more than 2,000 Tlaxcalans lay dead. Velázquez de León, among other fearless leaders, were nowhere to be found. Most of the survivors bore wounds. Their artillery, ammo, luggage, and the treasures they'd gathered were all lost. This horrific incident, which occurred on July 1st, 1520, is still referred to in New Spain as the Night of Sorrow. Their first stop was Tacuba, but they couldn't linger as the entire land was in uproar. The only place providing a safe refuge was Tlaxcala. To get there, they needed to cross the entire northern half of the Mexican lake, encountering a marshland on the western side, and for several days they had to hike through uncharted territory without the means to rejuvenate their spent bodies. But they had no other alternative. Their choice was either to give up any hope of probable rescue or continue their path. For 5 days, they crossed the seemingly infinite marshland. On the 6th morning, they arrived at Otumba, and as they climbed the neighboring hills, they saw the vast plain filled with countless warriors, a sight so daunting that only Cortes among them refused to yield to despair. His courage remained unshakable. His demeanor infused his soldiers with the realization that they needed to either triumph or perish. He revitalized his men, maintaining his composure, and directed them toward the adversary. Like long blades of grass being cut down by a mower, so were the foes sliced down by their swords. Their path marked by bloodshed and corpses, nothing could resist their onslaught. But eventually, their fatigue got to them. Their arms felt weightless. The enemy charged from all sides, and they would have met their end had not their vigilant leader saved them just in time. He spotted the Mexican leader carrying their battle flag from a distance. He remembered hearing that the Mexicans would declare defeat if their flag was taken, and his decision was immediate. Accompanied by his brave mounted officers, he sped into the midst of the troop guarding the banner, knocking the Mexican commander off his feet with a lance. One of his men dismounted, killed him, and claimed the flag. All other flags were instantly lowered, inducing panic, leading them to drop their weapons and flee. A stroke of genius thus rescued the Spaniards, granting them a victory as fruitful as it was glorified. When the spoils were gathered, their value nearly compensated for the treasures they'd abandoned in Mexico, since most of the overly confident Mexican warriors had adorned themselves with their most expensive jewelry. The next day, they entered the land of the friendly Tlaxcalans. They were worried their relationship had soured, but their concerns turned out to be baseless. Those honorable and big-hearted people stayed steadfast, as if the Spanish hadn't suffered any misfortunes. Among these folks, the Spanish recuperated, healing from their struggles and attending to their injuries. Everyone partook in relaxation except for Cortes, even though he had exerted and endured more than anyone else. He didn't have a moment to rest. He was busy crafting future strategies and was soon thrilled to discover that luck was still on his side. Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, was so confident that Narvaez would fulfill his mission with the substantial force provided to him that he sent him 2 additional ships filled with supplies and ammunition before receiving any updates. When they were cruising by Vera Cruz, the commanding officer convinced them to dock. He effortlessly seized the ships and with equal ease convinced the crew to join Cortes's ranks. This wasn't the only twist of fate that benefited him. Shortly after this, 3 unusually large ships, part of a fleet commissioned by the governor of Jamaica for exploration, arrived on the same coast. Their captain, unfortunately, steered toward the northern territories of the Mexican Empire, where the residents were poor and combative. He received an unfriendly welcome and, after a chain of misfortunes, finally made it to the harbor of Vera Cruz. His crew was also persuaded to sign up with Cortes. In this manner, Cortes managed to offset his previous losses with new recruits and resources. He now felt robust enough to revisit his grand scheme of conquering the Mexican Empire. Leading an army of 10,000 men, along with his trusted allies, the Tlaxcalans, and other united indigenous tribes, he was all set to move forward. Meanwhile, Emperor Cuitlahua died abruptly from smallpox. Following his death, the elected officials were called upon to pick his successor. Their job in this pivotal moment posed an immense responsibility. The head priests sought the favor of their ultimate divine being through the ensuing prayer. "O God, you are fully aware that our emperor's time has ended since you've laid him at your feet. He lingers in the place of rest. He has journeyed the path we all must embark on. He has proceeded to the destination we must all strive toward, the abode of everlasting darkness, impenetrable to light. His reign was brief. We were blessed with his rule for only a short time before you called him to succeed his predecessor. Therefore, he is grateful to you for relieving him from such a strenuous obligation and bestowing upon him peace and reprieve. But who will now look after the well-being of your people and the kingdom? Who will be appointed the role to enact justice for your people? Who will beat the drum and pipe to summon the seasoned warriors and the valorous to war? Our guardian and savior, will you, through your wisdom, select someone worthy to ascend the imperial throne, to assume the weighty mantle of rule, to care for and comfort your disenfranchised people, like a mother tenderly loves and soothes her children? O compassionate God, cast the glow of your visage upon this, your kingdom. Decree that in every circumstance, through every situation, honor shall be yours." The selection landed on Guatemozin. He was related to the 2 preceding emperors, being their nephew, and was barely past his mid-20s when he took the throne. Youthful as he was, he had a wealth of military experience and had stood out in numerous brutal battles. He despised the Spaniards as Hannibal despised Rome, and the moment he heard of his enemy's army being assembled, he rallied an exceptional force of warriors from all regions to the capital, with whom he resolved to fight to the bitter end. Cortes, being privy to his preparations, knew that he was up against severe challenges and risks, but he met them with his characteristic bravery. Bold and filled with fervor, he initiated the march towards Mexico, leading his significantly enlarged army. Chapter 14. Cortes engineers a combined assault by land and sea. A plot against his life is uncovered. The capital is confronted. As Cortes neared Texcoco's capital, intermediaries crossed paths with him signaling peace and insistently inviting him on behalf of their chieftain to establish his overnight base within the city. They promised every amenity for him and his crew's convenience. This solicitation was paired with a recommendation that Cortes's indigenous allies should establish camp outside the city limits. Cautious of the chieftain's true motives due to certain suspicions, he decided to accept the invitation instantly. At the same time, he was resolved to exercise utmost caution and make his entry immediately, which was done at noon on December 31st, 1520. Once Cortes occupied the largest and most strategically advantageous sector of the city, he disposed of the chieftain who had stayed loyal to the Mexicans at the expense of the Spanish. In his stead, He installed a man universally regarded by the citizens as the most deserving. This person, exquisite, was a young, friendly, and his exceptional demeanor was such that Cortes could not resist demonstrating his warmth towards him and guaranteeing his friendship. He also determined to establish his central command in the city until every detail of his plan to conquer Mexico was finalized. At this point in time, the Mexicans were deeply fortified. Where the causeways were disconnected, imposing barriers and barricades were designed to block the enemy from deploying portable bridges. The new emperor, Guatemozin, had equipped numerous warriors with bows and extended spears for self-defense over a significant distance. What's more, they had an endless supply of canoes, enabling them to launch attacks from all angles. Cortes was aware he couldn't consider seizing this highly fortified city without a fleet of small boats to deal with these canoes, but how was he going to acquire them? Only a handful of ship carpenters were part of his entire military force. All the necessary materials for building would have to be sourced from the Tlaxcalan forest, and his entire Spanish force would be inadequate to transport it from there to Texcoco. However, the larger the obstacles Cortes faced, the stronger his resolve to surmount them became. A significant group of Tlaxcalans was delegated to his carpenters for manual labor. While the required materials were being prepared, Cortes started to gain control over the entire region surrounding Mexico to cut off the unfortunate capital city's supplies. He subdued some towns by force and persuaded others to form an alliance with him using gentle tactics. Guatemozin watched the desertion and loss of his loyal subjects with sadness and anger and attempted, albeit unsuccessfully, to prevent it. Regardless, his strong spirit remained unflinching in his masculine resolve to protect his capital to the last drop of blood. Meanwhile, Cortes faced a looming threat that could potentially lead to a catastrophic end to his mission and his life. Narvaez's soldiers had willingly pledged their allegiance to Cortes. However, they had done so expecting to rapidly and effortlessly amass untold wealth. The obliteration of their expectations and the looming dangers involved in assaulting Mexico led to their immense dissatisfaction with Cortes and profound remorse for choosing to side with him. Villafanga, an ordinary soldier, yet cunning and bold, and still loyal to Velázquez, exploited his comrades' discontent and devised a scheme that revolved around the assassination of the general and his commanding officers, the appointment of a new leader, and a return to Cuba. The plan was thus: as Cortes and his key officers dined, a large stack of letters from Vera Cruz would be delivered. Under the guise of longing for news from their homeland, the conspirators would gather around the general as he opened the letters, and unexpectedly kill him and the other chosen targets. Everything was set for their sinister objective. The subsequent day was chosen, and the sizable group of conspirators had laid out their strategies so covertly that neither Cortes nor his allies had an inkling of their plot. However, at the 11th hour, one of the co-conspirators, a man who had been with Cortes from the beginning, was suddenly filled with guilt. Afflicted with a pricking conscience, he ultimately rushed to Cortes's quarters and confessed everything. Cortes was shocked, but composed himself quickly, determining his course of action. He and a few of his officers promptly headed to Villafanga's living quarters. The suddenness of his appearance in such an unexpected setting threw the would-be assailant off guard to the point that he couldn't deny his culpability or formulate an alibi. He was instantly apprehended. Cortes pulled out a piece of paper the man was attempting to hide in his shirt, surmising it must be connected to the plot. Setting aside a moment to peruse it, he found it was a roster of the conspirators, which took him aback. However, he smartly hid his reaction and gave no indication of its contents, feigning ignorance about any other people's involvement. He decided to punish the core perpetrator, and given the man's self-incrimination, deemed any further inquiry unnecessary. Villafanga was executed by hanging that same night, right outside his residence where he had been captured. The following morning, Cortes called together his entire team and disclosed Villafanga's deception and the swift repercussion that resulted. However, he added that despite his best attempts, he had yet to uncover any accomplices, since Villafanga had managed to maintain his silence even during grueling interrogation. Cortes told them he was, personally, relieved, as it would have saddened him greatly, to have turned more of his fellow soldiers over to the law. He ended his address by openly inviting feedback on any shortcomings in his strategy or instances where he had caused discontent among his men, so he could make immediate amendments. This pronouncement eased the fears of the implicated parties. They could breathe easy again, knowing they escaped detection and, in their relief, they resolved to present Cortes with even stronger and more unwavering allegiance at every possible instance. Cortes knew full well that doing nothing can lead even the best of men astray, so he took action to keep the disruptors busy, leaving them no time for bad ideas. Fortunate as ever, he found out that the materials for building 13 ships were ready to be transported from the forests of Tlaxcala to Texcoco. With the job requiring native bearers and a hefty guard to keep the Mexicans at bay, he chose the troublemakers for the task and enlisted the reliable and brave Sandoval to lead them. The journey was one of the toughest they'd endured. 8,000 bearers burdened with beams, planks, masts, ropes, sails, and ironwork travelled in the centre of a convoy more than a mile long. A contingent of 15,000 Tlaxcalan warriors covered them from all sides, with the Spanish soldiers spaced out among them to maintain order and teach them disciplined marching. Sandoval led the pack, leaving the front column in the hands of young Tlaxcalan leader Chichimecatl, as the rebellious Xicotencatl was no longer around. Unable to bear the idea of surrendering to foreigners, he instigated a rebellion. But he met with fierce resistance from his own people, even his father, in an act of dispassionate judgment, passed the death sentence and handed him over to the Spanish general, Cortes. Well aware of the young man's zeal, Cortes displayed great empathy, spared his life, freed him, and took him along on the march towards Mexico. But even such generosity couldn't thaw his stubborn heart. He never missed a chance to criticize the Spaniards' agenda outrightly and discourage his people from supporting them.